ኤፍኤም አፍደገ ዘመናዊ ትግራይ
Today, on 19th June, it is the International Day of Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. It's the day the world set aside to remember what survivors have endured, to stand with them, and to demand accountability. We are here to do that with a particular focus on Tigray and on the many other places where the same crime is committed. Before we go further, let me introduce myself. My name is Kochok Gabru. I am a PhD researcher at Leiden University Medical Center. I look at trauma and resilience among conflict-related sexual violence survivors in Tigray. I'm also a lecturer in Mekelle University. And I also, before I go further, that brought this event together. We have Gender Empowerment Movement Tigray, Sibago Disability Service Organization, Gorzo Movement to Empower Women, the Health Professional Network for Tigray, the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, Nolawi Women and Children Recovery and Development Organization, Solidarity of Tigrans for Independence and Liberty, and Yuhono, a movement to end gender-based violence. This event is a result of their work, and we are grateful for all of them. Before we go into the session, just a few practical points would be important. First, please keep all comments and questions respectful. This is a survivor-centered space, and we ask everyone to treat it as such. Second, please be aware that today's discussion may be difficult. We'll be talking about violence and we'll be hearing about painful experiences, and it might bring up strong emotions. If at any point you need to step away, turn off your camera, take a break, we would understand that. And third, the session is being recorded. And at the same time, there are media partners who will be broadcasting it later on. So please keep that in mind and take every precaution if you need to do so. And with that, let me provide a brief overview. I'll just phrase a few points. First, conflict-related sexual violence is a crime under international law in its own right. It should not be treated as a side effect of or a byproduct of war. In many contexts, it is deliberately used as a tactic to terrorize, control, humiliate, displace, and destroy individuals and communities. The second point is it extends beyond the individual survivor. Research has consistently shown that it functions as an attack on families, on identity, and collective belonging. Third, in Tigray, the violence was documented at a scale that's very difficult to even comprehend. Recent findings from a large-scale assessment by the Commission of Inquiries in Tigray showed that they interviewed almost 500,000 women in Tigray, which they found over 286 women have experienced at least one form of gender-based violence, and from that, over 150,000 women experienced rape. The fourth point that I would want to make is even where survivors came forward, accessing support was very difficult. Many faced destroyed healthcare infrastructures, unavailable medication, and services that could not guarantee standard response, leaving the majority without adequate psychological justice and livelihood support that they needed. So, having made this point, today, our speakers will take us deeper into each of these. I'm honored to moderate this session, and I want to begin by welcoming a video from Ms. Reem Al-Salem, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls. This is a video message that I will be sharing right now.
Distinguished colleagues, representatives of civil society, friends, thank you for the invitation to join you today as we commemorate the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence and Conflict. I would like to begin by acknowledging the important work of those documenting and responding to the violence experienced by women and girls in Ethiopia, including in other parts of the world. The efforts remind us that beyond every statistics is a human being whose life, dignity, and future have been profoundly affected. Today is a day of remembrance, but it must also be a day of action. Conflict-related sexual violence is not an inevitable byproduct of war. It's not an unfortunate accident. It's deliberate. It's a grave violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. In many conflicts, it is deliberately used to terrorize also communities, to break them, to conquer them, to subjugate them, and to punish perceived enemies, displace populations, destroy social bonds, and assert control. Women and girls bear the brunt of these crimes, although, of course, men and boys can also be victims. Sexual violence in conflict leaves deep physical, psychological, social, and economic scars that often endure long after weapons fall silent. Survivors may face stigma, rejection, poverty, displacement, and lifelong trauma. Children born of rape may also suffer discrimination and exclusion. In many conflicts around the world, allegations of widespread sexual violence have emerged from areas affected by armed conflict. Survivors and witnesses have described acts of rape, gang rape, sexual torture, sexual slavery, and horrific other forms of sex and gender-based violence. These accounts reveal not only the brutality of the individual perpetrators, but also the devastating impact that such violence has on entire communities. What is particularly alarming is that we can clearly see a recurring pattern across conflicts globally, because sexual violence and other forms of sex and gender-based violence do not occur in isolation. They are often accompanied by killings, forced displacement, destruction of livelihood, denial of humanitarian assistance, and attacks on essential services. Yet despite this growing recognition of this phenomena, accountability remains an exception rather than the rule. Because perpetrators believe, and they are right until now, that they can act with impunity. Too often, survivors are denied justice. Too often, political considerations outweigh the rights and needs of victims. Ending conflict sexual violence requires more than the condemnation. It requires genuine political will to investigate these allegations promptly, independently, and impartially, holding perpetrators accountable, regardless of the rank, affiliation, or status. It requires also ensuring that survivors have access to medical care, psychological support, legal assistance, and reparations. In order to break the cycle of repetition, prevention must also be at the center of our efforts. We know that sexual violence flourishes when discrimination against women and girls is tolerated, where militarization and the impunity I've spoken about prevails, and where women are excluded from decision-making, from peacemaking, from conflict resolution. So the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence begins long before conflict erupts. It must, and it requires addressing the structural inequalities and the discriminatory norms that make particularly women and girls vulnerable in the first place. It also requires that we don't see women only as victims of conflict. They are leaders, mediators, defenders, caregivers, agents of change. Sustainable peace cannot be achieved when half of the population is excluded from shaping it. As the Special Rapporteur on violence against women and girls, I have repeatedly emphasized that violence against women and girls exists on a continuum. The violence women experience during conflict is often connected to the violence they experience before conflict and after conflict. Armed conflict magnifies existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. Unless these root causes are addressed, cycles of violence will persist. We must also recognize that armed conflict may overlap with also forced displacement due to environmental degradation and climate change. And women and girls are also vulnerable to sexual violence that may happen as a result of their increased impoverishment and marginalization and destitution. In all of this, civil society organizations have a critical role to play. They document violations, they support survivors, they advocate for accountability, and they ensure that the voices of affected women and girls are heard. In many contexts, including in Ethiopia, local women's organizations have been amongst the first responders and amongst the strongest advocates for justice. Their work deserves greater protection, recognition, and support. This is, however, unlikely to be forthcoming, not just in Ethiopia, but also around the world, if the cuts to humanitarian and developing funding continues worldwide. As we mark this day, we must also listen to survivors themselves. They don't simply seek sympathy, they seek justice, they seek truth, recognition, guarantees that this will not happen again. Their courage in speaking out should inspire us, but most importantly, to move beyond statements of concern towards concrete action. So let me conclude with a simple but important message. While we have to remain realistic, we must believe that eliminating sexual violence in conflict is not an unattainable aspiration or goal. It is a legal obligation. It is within our reach, and it is a moral imperative. And without it, we cannot achieve sustainable peace nor development. So we owe it to the survivors in Ethiopia and around the world to ensure that their suffering is neither ignored nor forgotten. We owe it to future generations to build societies in which women's bodies are never treated as battlefields and where dignity, equality, and justice prevails over violence and impunity. Thank you.
We thank the special rapporteur on this powerful message. It gave us the wider picture of what conflict-related sexual violence looks. And also, I think it had a very powerful message that we can work towards completely eradicating this violence at the same time that survivors, we need to move from statements into concrete action to bring healing, justice, and accountability to survivors. I think she also made a good point that grassroots women on the ground and grassroots organization carry majority of these responsibilities. So having said that, I will now hand over the platform to Muna Bashir, an engineer from Western Tigray, a former refugee in Sudan, and now a returnee who is herself internally displaced for more than 3 years in Sudan. She worked with NGOs to support Tigrayan refugees, especially survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. She continues to serve her community today. Muna will speak on the impact of conflict-related sexual violence on IDPs and refugees. Muna, I'll hand over to you.
Hello, everyone. Let me share my first. I think you can see my screen, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming here. Today, I will be presenting the impact of conflict related sexual violence onto specific populations, the Tigrayan refugee in Sudan, and the internal displaced people inside Tigray. So when we go, what is CRSV or conflict-related sexual violence? Under international law, conflict-related sexual violence is unequivocally a war crime and a crime against humanity in Tigray conflict. CRSV was not random. It was systematically, deliberately deployed as a weapon of war to terrorize population, drive displacement, and destroy the social fabric of entire community. In the scale of crisis, to understand the impact, we must first grasp the number and what lies behind them. Inside Tigray, over 2 million people are internally displaced. Among internally displaced persons, family heads, one study found that more than 57% suffer from post-trauma stress disorder. When we come to across the border, over 60,000 Tigrayan have fled to Sudan seeking safety, but safety has proven elusive. Sudan-owned civil war has created a double crisis for refugees, and the tragic cycle between January and November 2024, over 4,700 units of family Ethiopian returners from Sudan ended back in IDPs camp inside Tigray, Mekelle, displaced once, twice, then returned to starvation. And what is the impact of physical and psychological impact on both in IDP inside Tigray and as well as Tigrayan refugee in Sudan? So inside Tigray, we use few example like Hizaz camp, Abi Adi, and Salalakha, Mayhansa. And the one impact is starvation as weapon. When we go to Hizaz camp, over 50 people verified starvation deaths since July 2025. Along the only grain distributed to some camp is contaminated, causing chronic diarrhea, vomiting, accelerated malnutrition, especially among the elderly and the infant. As a result of ongoing bureaucratic obstruction by central authorities, entire camp have received no meaningful food aid since 2025. And medical and sanitation collapse, let's say Abi Adi camp, there is no functional latrine system for over 18 months. Open defecation has triggered as cholera outbreak over 300 suspected cases as of October 2025. Maternal health catastrophe. Pregnant of conflict-related sexual violence survivor receive zero prenatal care, no rape crisis service, no HIV post-exposure prophylaxis, no emergency contraception, no fistula repair, despite thousands of documented conflict-related sexual violence cases. This is example of elder people who live in Hizaz camp. Despair among young people with no hope of returning home. Hopefully you listen to me, yeah?
Yes, but can co-host support and unmuting? Yes, there are some.
Okay, despair among young people, like with no hope of returning home, young people are fleeing illegally to support elderly parents. Many are exposed to assault, trafficking, or death. Young people are vanishing without a trace. At the same time, the Pretoria betrayal, civilian protection and humanitarian access remain zero implanted in these camps. International monitors have been denied access to Tigray since 2024, and it is now 2026. Just has not come. Food has not come. This is no longer just a political crisis. It is a moral test, and the international community is failing on this part. And when we go to Tigray refugee in Sudan, they have a double crisis, widespread untreated mental health crisis. Refugees face severe unaddressed psychological condition, including PTSD, depression, suicidal thought that rob them of rest and create an environmental constant fear, collapsing social and family structure. Collective trauma is eroding family unit. Children are being raised in atmosphere dominated by grief, dread, threatening healthy development, and critical lack of accessible support. Psychological care is drastically underfunded and out of reach for most survivors, despite the overwhelming need. Intergenerational consequences without action. If urgent intervention doesn't occur, this unhealed psychological wound will pass to a future generation, deepening an already catastrophic humanitarian crisis. And this is returning from Sudan to Hizaz camp. This is their testimony. We fled the Tigray war to Sudan for safety. Then Sudan burned, so we come back. Now we are watching our children starve in Hizaz. There is no door that leads to safety. There is only death waiting in different uniforms. That's what they said. And the other thing is the collapse of childhood, shelter, dignity, then the unseen front of crisis. Education, a generation deliberately erased. Nearly 400,000 children have lost over 4 years of schooling. Makeshift class under 3 are worthless, no book, no pencil. Starving children are too weak to concentrate on education. For example, a 12 years old child now reads at grade 2 level. Do you imagine that? Without intensive catch-up program, which do not exist. He or she will never recover. This is not collateral damage. This is structural erasure, raising an illiterate, unemployable generation easy to exploit. Shelter is like an open air prison, not temporary housing. Humanitarian standards require weather-resistant shelter repair every 6 months. In Tigray camp, family received 1 torn tarp in 2022 and nothing since. Rain bring mud-soaked ground. Infant caused hypothermia, pneumonia. In dry season, it bring heat stroke, and wind shared what little covers exist. Torn walls offer no privacy or safety. Women and girls cannot change, bathe, or sleep unseen, a constant re-traumatization for sexual violence survivor, and an open invitation for predator at night. And hygiene, when we come to hygiene, dignity, sacrifice to starvation. Sanitary pads are unavailable or cost 4 or 5 times pre-war prices more than a week food. Women use rags, leaves, or dried mud, causing chronic infection, UTI, bacterial vaginosis, with no antibiotic available. During menstruation, women hide for 5 or 7 days each month, unable to collect food, firewood, or attend class. Girls fall further behind. No soap, no clean water, no privacy latrine. Reusable clothes cannot be washed properly. Blood attract flies and parasites. That the choice is brutal. And feed a child or bleed with dignity. So most of them choose a child. And when we come the struggle for justice and accountability, Accountability is non-negotiable. Without justice, conflict-related sexual violence become normalized. Perpetrators face no consequences, survivors receive no recognition, and the cycle of violence is guaranteed to repeat. Impunity is not passive, it's a permission. And immediate lifeline must reach survivor now. Sustained, unrestricted funding is urgently needed for medical care, mental health support, and food aid for both refugees in Sudan and IDP inside Tigray. Survival comes first. Justice system must be repealed to prioritize conflict-related sexual violence. Legal frameworks must be strengthened to make conflict-related sexual violence a priority crime. This means specialized court program, gender-sensitive transitional justice, and dismantling the structural barrier that keeps survivors silent. And fourth is survivor must lead, not to be afterthought. Every policy, program, and legal reform must be designed with survivor at the center, not as a symbol, but as the compass guiding all decisions. Their voice, need, and dignity must shape every step. And this is our conclusion. So the conflict-related sexual violence crisis in Tigray is not over. It has become a border humanitarian catastrophe affecting millions, yet the violence continues. Justice remains absent. The international community has largely looked away. Pretoria has failed. Its core commitment to territorial integrity, safe return of the displaced, and accountability remain unfulfilled. The ceasefire has become a tool of management, not peace. Insisting on Pretoria alone is no longer viable. The alternatives are difficult but necessary. A new unified Tigrayan political voice capable of real negotiation. Survivor-centered justice has that prioritizes mental health and reparation over performative trials. Urgent third-party mediation to prevent a slide into civil war. Genuine international pressure not to salvage Pretoria, but to enforce accountability. And thank you. That's all I have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Mona. And just for those who have joined later, I would like to remind you that this session is being recorded, and also there are media outlets that are partnering with us today. And thank you, Mona, again for your powerful presentation. You have highlighted the interconnected crisis facing Tigrayan refugees, returnees, and internally displaced communities and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And now I will first check if Tariq is there. Batseba, can you confirm if Tariq has joined us?
Yes, she is there. She's going to join us.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So now our next speaker is Tariq Taddesa. She's a disability rights advocate from Aksum, Tigray, with more than 20 years of work advancing the rights, inclusion, and dignity of persons with disabilities through the Sibago Disability Service Organization. She leads advocacy, research, and community-based initiatives focused on people with disabilities, particularly women, children, and older people, and those affected by conflict and displacement. She's also a founding member of Tigray Disability Association, where she previously served as a chairperson. Tariq will be speaking in tigrigna, and I will briefly summarize in English later on. Tariq, ندحر تدالي خوين خي تجمر تخليخ.
Hi, Kochavi. She's trying to join because of the connection issue, but she should be joining very shortly. In 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So we'll have a discussion later on. But if you would like to put your questions or comments in the chat section for everyone, then that would be possible. I think for the sake of time and management, Jonas, you could put your questions or comments in the chat section and we can address them if that's okay. But we will have dedicated discussion time towards the end. Thank you.
She just joined, so we can have.
So, Tariq, if you can start the presentation. مجمار تخلي أخي.
سلام.
سلام. يسمعي.
سلام سمعنا.
هو.
كما لكن سلام ده kita dikaitan dan kita bisa dikaitan dengan sorry belajar pergi.
ድምፅኺ ፅቡቕ የለይ ይቆራረፅ ኣሎ እንደገና ርሑቕ ይኽኒ ኢኺ ብንፁር ኣይኮነን እዮ
ሄድፎን ተውሳዶ ዳም ስማዕላ
ፅቡቕ ኣውፂኺ ሞክሪ
እሺ ሰላም ይስማዕ ልክኹም يسمع لهم؟
أوه.
እሺ ታሪክ ይባል ስራሕ መካይድት ናይ ሲባጎስ ዲስኤብል ሰርቪስ ኦርጋናይዜሽን እያ ለማዓንቲ ስለ ዝዓድምካኒ ቴንኪዩ ሕዚ ዘቕርበልክን ናይ ኣካል ጉዳት ኣብ ትግራይ ደለዉ ተመዛበልቲ ከመይ ኣክሰሲብል ይረኽቡ ዶ ኣይረኽቦን ዝብሉ ሓበሬታን ክንመኻኸር እየ መፅእ ዘለኹ ቴንኪዩ يسمع الذي
يسمع اللي تعرف تبغى introduce كير خلنا له على خمو هذي تن حسيان لما تأخ حسابات شير مقارات خليخ
الشيء سلسته
تغلب بلك ترجمية
الشيء ኣብ ክልል ትግራይ ብዙሓት ኣካል ጉዳት ከም ዘለዉ ይፍለጥ እዩ ቅድሚ ሕዚ 17% ኣብ ትግራይ ኣካል ጉዳት ነይሮም ይበሃል ነይሩ ሕዚ ግን ይፋ ዝኾነሉ ምክንያት ሓድሽ ኣሎ 30.5% ኣካል ጉዳት ኣለው ኣብ ትግራይ ተባሂሉ ይሕሰብ ብሰራሕተኛ ማሕበር ጉዳይ ክልል ዝተዋህበ ኣንፈት ካብኣቶም እቶም ዝበዝሑ ኣብ ተፈናቐልቲ ከም ዝርከቡ ኣንፈታት ይሕብሩ ንሳቶም እውን ኣብ ከባቢየት ዘለው ኣብ ክልተ ዞባታት ኣለው ኣብ ማእኸላይ ዞባን ሰሜን ምዕራብን ኣብ ከባቢና ኣለው ከም ሲዋጎስ ክንሰርሕ ከለና ኣብ ክልቲኦም ብዙሕ በተለይ ኣብ ሽረ ሞር ብዙሓት ኣካል ጉድኣት ዝርከብዎ ኣይዲፒ እዩ ካብኡ ከዓኒ ኣክሰሲብል ዘይኮነሉ ኢኻ ትርኢ ምክንያቱም ንዓቶም ዘዳምፅ ናይ ባዕሎም ዝኾነ ሽንት ቤት ናይ ባዕሎም ዝኾነ ኩሉ ነገር ናይ ባዕሎም ዝኾነ ነገራት የብሎምን ምክንያቱም ሓበሬታ የብሎምን ኣክሰሲብል ኣይኮነን እቲ እንኳን እቲ ቦታ እቲ ዝነብሩሉ ቦታ እውን ነቶም ኣካል ጉድኣት ዝምችው ኣይኮነን ወለዶም ልዕሊ እቶም ዝበዝሑ ኣካል ጉድኣት ከዓኒ ተመዛበልቲ ህፃናት እዮም ካብኡ ቀፂሎም ከዓኒ ኣረጋውያን ታው ብበዝሒ ክንሪኦ ከለና ግን ደቂ ኣንስትዮ እውን ሞሪ ኣብቲ ሚዛን ይወስዳ ወይ ድማ ብፐርሰንት ክንሪኦ ከለና ደቂ ኣንስትዮ ይበዝሓና ደቂ ኣንስትዮ ከምቲ ዝፍለጥ ናይ መናፅሂ ኩሉ ነገራት ኣክሴሲብል ስለዘይረኽባ በቲ ዘለወን ናይ ጉድኣተን ናብ ሕማማት ተወሰኽቲ ሕማማት ክቃልዓ ኢኻ ትረክብ ምክንያቱም ፌስቱላ ካልኦት ሕማማት ተቃሊዐን እየን ዝርከባ ናይ ምግቢ ሕፅረት ኣለወን ናይ ግንዛቤ ሕፅረት ኣለወን ኩሉ ማለትም ኣካል ጉድኣት ናይ ሓበሬታ ዝረኽብሉ ቦታ ሕፁር ስለዝኾነ ከም ንሕና ዲፓርትመንት ኣለዎም ተወከልቲ ኣለዎም ግን ከምቲ ተወከልቲ ዘለዎ መጠን ዝረኽብዎም ሓበሬታታት ውሕዳት እዮም እና በዚ ኣንጻር ደቂ ኣንስትዮ ኣካል ጉድኣት ተፈናቐልቲ ብጣዕሚ ኣብ ሓደጋ ከም ዘለው የርእየና ሕቶታት ተልዕሉ ኣብ ዝኽእልሉ ዕድላት ኣይኮኑን ዘለው ምክንያቱም ሕቶታት ከልዕልሉ ኣብ ዝኽእልሉ ደረጃ ለምሳሌ ከምዚ ኮይና ኢና እዚ ገበረና ሽንቲ ቤት ይብና ምግቢ ይብና መፅለሊ እውን ቸንዳ እውን ለኣካል ጉድኣት ዝምቸ ይኮነ ምክንያቱም ኣካል ጉድኣት ንቁሪ ንሕማማት ተቃላዕቲ ተወሳኺ ሕማማት ተቃልዐቲ ስለዝኾኑ በዚ ኣንጻር ኩነታት እቲ ዘለዎ ይኸውዶም ማለት እዩ ደቂ ኣንስትዮ ከዓ ይዓዝዝ ማለት እዩ እቲ ጉድኣት በዚ ኣንጻር ክልቲኡ ዘለው ኣይዲታት ኣብዛ ናተይ ሞር ኣብ ኣክሱም ከባቢያን ክናገር ከለኹ በዝሒ 1,500 ብቻ ኣካል ጉድኣት ኣብ ዳታና ተቐሚጦም ይርከቡ በዚ ኣንጻር ልጥቕዓት ደቂ ኣንስትዮ ዝተቃልዑ እዩ እቲ ቦታ ዘለዎ በዚ ኣንጻር ኣካል ጉድኣት ደቂ ኣንስትዮ ንሓደጋን ንብዙሓት ሕማማትን ተቃሊዖም ስለ ዝርከቡ ብዙሕ ጠመተ ዘድልየሉ እዩ ለምሳሌ ናይ ግንዛቤ ሕፅረት ኣሎ ናይ ኢንፎርሜሽን ሕፅረት ኣሎ ብዙሕ ነገራት ስለ ዝገጥመን ፕሮጀክት ተቐሪፁ ኣብዚ በተለይ ለምሳሌ ንሓደ ናይ ጂቢቢ ተቃላዕቲ እንዳኾናና እየን ዝርከባ ምክንያቱም ኣብቲ ሓገዝ ኣብቲ ሕክምና ኩሉ ዝረኽብሉ ግልጋሎታት ትረኽብሉ ኣብ ዘይኽእልሉ ስለ ዝበፅሑ ዘለው ወይ ድማ ስለ ዝበፅሓ ዘለዋ እዚ ፎከስ ተዝገበረና ክብል ይፈቱ ይቕኒለ ቴንክ ዩ
Okay, thank you so much. Tarek, that was a very important presentation or the status of people living with different forms of disability in Tigray. And I think I will just maybe summarize a few of the major points that you raised. I hope I will accurately capture the points. Tariq started by presenting how in Tigray the number of people living with disabilities has increased post-war, where it was documented to be 17%. Now is recently has been disclosed by the relevant authorities that it's over 30%. I think you said 30.5 to be exact. So if I had missed that, please correct me in the comment section. 100% يلخن يا أخي تاريك؟
ኣብ ኣክሱም ብትግራይ ደረጃ 30.5
Okay, thank you. So it's 30.5%, and majority of these people are currently living, are displaced, and there is a high number of women who are affected by the different forms of disabilities, and there is a very high gap in making the infrastructures, especially in the IDP sites, accessible to them, like bathrooms, even their living spaces. And at the same time, there is inadequate food coverage, and of course, this is disproportionately impacting women, children, and older people. And Tariq also emphasized that there is a huge gap in access to information, even though there are different representatives. It's not as they're not working as active in this platform in this area of advocating, and also kind of organizing and asking the right questions. And she also gave an example where in Aksum, Sibago has currently registered 1,500 people with disabilities, working with them, showing even in this one, showing how it's important to work towards inclusive service and support systems. I hope I was able to capture your message, Tariq. Thank you so much for that. Having said this, I will now go to our next presenter, Lindsay Green. Lindsay Green is the Deputy Director of Research at Physicians for Human Rights, where she oversees the organization's research and investigations. Her work focuses on sexual and reproductive violence, attacks on healthcare, and violence against children, with field experience in more than a dozen countries since 2021. She and PHR have worked with partners in Ethiopia to document conflict-related sexual violence and reproductive violence in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar. Lindsay will speak on medical and psychological consequences of the violence. Yeah, Lindsay, thank you so much, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's such an honor to be here with all of you today, and I'm very grateful for the other speakers for sharing your experiences and perspectives. I've been asked to speak about the medical and psychological consequences of conflict-related sexual violence in Tigray, and I'll also share some results from our research, as our moderator said at the beginning, but just a reminder that this content is quite difficult, so please feel free to take a break if you would like. And again, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor. Just to give a little bit of information about Physicians for Human Rights, we use medicine and science to document and call attention to human rights violations. PHR was founded on the idea that physicians and health professionals possess very unique skills that lend significant credibility to investigations and documentation of human rights abuses. And in 2011, so many years ago now, PHR launched its program on sexual violence in conflict zones, and we've worked to confront impunity for sexual violence in the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Iraq, Kenya, Myanmar, and Ukraine, and elsewhere. PHR has conducted research to understand the scale and scope of conflict-related sexual violence in a variety of conflicts and contexts. And we've brought this expertise to our work with partners in Ethiopia. First, to ground us, according to the most recent UN Secretary General's, the Special Representative to the Secretary General on Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, her report, state and non-state actors continue to perpetrate sexual violence as a tactic of war, torture, terrorism, and political repression at an alarming and increasing scale every year. And we know that the cases of conflict-related sexual violence that are reported likely represent a vast underestimate of the total documented cases. And these are also not just crises of conflict-related sexual violence, but we continue to see the intersection of conflict-related sexual violence with other violence and violations. A list of examples that are certainly not exhaustive include the intersection of conflict-related sexual violence occurring alongside reproductive violence in Ethiopia, which I'll speak about shortly, conflict-related sexual violence occurring alongside displacement in the DRC and Ethiopia, as we've heard already, reports of CRSV, starvation, and mass killing in El Fasher in Sudan, and the complex intersections of reproductive violence, starvation, and attacks on health that we see occurring, for example, in Gaza today. This has important implications for documentation, including prioritizing documentation of CRSV, for what justice and accountability looks like, and for what survivors need. And medical evidence has a critical role to play in the documentation of CRSV, as it helps to preserve critical evidence to support justice and accountability, but also can identify what survivors need now to support access to care and healing. Turning to Ethiopia and to Tigray specifically, PHR has been working with partners in Ethiopia, including the Organization for Justice and Accountability in the Horn of Africa, Health Professionals Network for Tigray, and other partners that I've seen on this call since 2021 to support health professionals and human rights defenders in documenting violence using standardized forensic tools.
Sorry, Lindsay,
No problem. I fixed it. Through these partnerships, we identified a need for systematic documentation of the scale, scope, and patterns of perpetration of conflict-related sexual violence committed in Ethiopia to ensure accountability for these violations. PHR and OJA published our first report, which was based on a review of forensic medical records in August 2023. In this report, we found that sexual violence in Tigray was a clear tactic used during the active conflict period between November 2020 and November 2022, and has continued since the signing of the Pretoria Agreement in November 2022. These data showed that sexual and reproductive violence was committed in Tigray by the government of Ethiopia and allied forces, notably Eritrean military forces, who were frequently identified by partners on the ground as the perpetrators of these brutal and deliberate acts of sexual violence. In the post-COA period, there's been a clear escalation of conflict in other regions of Ethiopia, including Amhara, Afar, and Oromia. And we see a direct link to these surges of CRSV in other regions of Ethiopia to the presence of ongoing conflict in these places, but also the lack of atrocity prevention and justice and accountability for the conflict in Tigray and the crimes that were committed there. For the research that I'll speak a bit more about today, we worked with OJA to take a mixed methods approach to try to document the patterns of conflict-related sexual violence in Ethiopia, with a specific focus at looking at the medical impacts of CRSV and what we can learn from those medical records and the medical and psychological perspective about what has occurred and also what survivors need now. Just very quickly, our methodology included a survey of healthcare workers who provided care to survivors of sexual and reproductive violence, a review of over 500 de-identified medical records, and then 40 key informant interviews and 4 focus group discussions with healthcare workers, humanitarian actors, and community leaders supporting survivors. Our data was collected in the Tigray, Amhara, and Afar regions, but I'll focus specifically on the data from Tigray today, looking at the period from the start of hostilities in Tigray in November 2020 through the end of when we collected our data in October 2024. And this mixed methods approach was really important because it allows us to triangulate the data around the important themes that we see related to sexual and reproductive violence perpetration by looking not only at survivors' medical records, but also the experiences of healthcare workers who can speak to what they saw within their broader patient population. So what were some of our key findings? Our first were that survivors across Ethiopia experienced brutal and deliberate forms of conflict-related sexual and reproductive violence, which caused severe and permanent physical and psychological harm to survivors, their families, and their communities. In Tigray, we found that CRSV was widespread and systematic. The crimes represent crimes against humanity that have been committed in Tigray, specifically related to the perpetration of sexual and reproductive violence. And we're particularly concerned by the targeting of women and girls, including the crime of forced pregnancy, which we found within the data that we looked at. We heard really harrowing stories of women experiencing multiple perpetrator rape, being held in captivity after experiencing sexual violence until giving birth. 90% of the healthcare workers that we surveyed saw at least a few patients who had experienced unwanted pregnancies from conflict-related sexual violence. This quotation from a psychologist in Tigray describes a survivor who had a contraceptive implant forcibly removed before sexual violence with the intent to impregnate this survivor. And finally, this quote speaks about what we saw frequently within the medical records and the interviews that we conducted, which was that that survivors in Tigray experienced perpetrators inserting objects inside of them after sexual violence with the intent of harming their reproductive capacity. These are really difficult stories to hear, but I think it really speaks to the importance of looking at the medical evidence to understand what has happened to survivors and what care they need now. We were able to, because we were triangulating the medical records with survey data and interviews, we could also look at the intent of perpetrators in Tigray that was expressed to survivors. And we found that many healthcare workers provided care to survivors who had experienced perpetrators using language that spoke to the desire to eradicate the Tigrayan ethnic group as part of sexual violence. 73% of surveyed healthcare workers treated survivors who reported that perpetrators used language expressing intent to destroy their ability to reproduce or have children. And these perpetrators included Ethiopian and Eritrean militaries. 84% of healthcare workers indicated survivors identified members of the Eritrean military as perpetrators, and 73% of healthcare workers indicated survivors identified members of the Ethiopian military as perpetrators, and 51% indicated Amhara militias or Fano. So this is really important data because, one, it documents what has happened to many within the community in Tigray. And also it helps us understand what the medical and psychological needs are and what the consequences are of CRSV. Survivors, as I think many will already know on this call because you're deeply engaged in this work, continue to need complex and long-term healthcare to address the physical and mental health impact of conflict-related sexual and reproductive violence. Within the medical records we reviewed in Tigray, 50% of patients tested were positive for STIs and 17% were positive for HIV, which in comparison to the national HIV prevalence rate in Ethiopia of 0.09% is a really vast difference. As I said, 90% of healthcare workers saw at least a few patients with unwanted pregnancies. And within the medical records we reviewed, 10% of patients had reported unwanted pregnancies. Survivors also presented with a range of psychological presentations following conflict-related sexual violence that are expected but also require long-term and consistent care. So our key drawing from this, we reach a few key conclusions. The first is that there is a need for justice and accountability for sexual and reproductive violence committed in Tigray by all actors. The deliberate and grave nature of the sexual violence committed, along with reports by Tigrayan survivors of perpetrators' expressed intent to prevent further Tigrayan births, requires further investigation and justice and accountability. And also, the failure to meaningfully respond to the crimes committed in Tigray has led to a spread of atrocities, unfortunately, as we see in other regions of Ethiopia now that are also grappling with this violence. Despite the systemic nature and scale of these ongoing violations, there's really been no meaningful justice or accountability for survivors in Tigray or in other parts of Ethiopia. And the failure to address past crimes has created an environment of impunity that facilitates continued violations, enabling the geographic spread of violence, as I said, and denying survivors their fundamental right to remedy and redress. We're particularly concerned about the reports of escalating violence in Tigray and in other parts of Ethiopia, and the implications that this would have on access to healthcare for survivors who still have ongoing needs that need to be met following these cases of CRSV. Healthcare systems have already been damaged during the war. We know in Tigray that there has been a real effort, but a lot of challenge in rebuilding the healthcare system. And the system in Tigray currently faces considerable challenges to operate due to this lack of rehabilitation, the lack of funding. And health professionals report to PHR and our partners that they have a persistent fear and overwhelming sense of helplessness around the prospect of renewed fighting and what this would mean for access to medical care. For example, we're very concerned about the Tigray Regional Health Bureau's issuing of an urgent appeal indicating that they are running out of fuel and medical supplies and have not been able to even pay health workers since January. This has an immediate impact on survivors because when supplies are scarce and there's limited access to resupply, health systems are increasingly forced to withhold non-emergency care, which directly impacts survivors of CRSV who may be seeking care for ongoing health needs or mental health needs. And this really limits their ability to access the necessary resources to heal. Additionally, the impact of US funding cuts and other donors' cuts to global health has really created a climate of fear and further impacted survivors' access to quality services, which many have deliberately built in Tigray since the conflict in a way to be survivor-centered and trauma-informed. So we see a lot of reasons why looking at the medical and psychological consequences of conflict-related sexual violence on survivors helps us chart a clear path for priorities. And we really hope that we can all, and I know we all every day use this as a call to try to advocate for survivors of conflict-related sexual or reproductive violence in Tigray to be able to access services that are survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and comprehensive to address their needs. And we also hope that in the future there's access to justice and accountability as well to help further this healing. Thank you again so much for having me, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. It is an honor to have you. And thank you so much for you and for your team for doing all the important work documenting the systematic nature of conflict-related sexual violence and the different consequences it has brought on survivors and communities. Clearly, the findings that Lindsay just presented have highlighted the devastating, lasting impact that the CRSV has had on survivors. And we really need to reinforce that we need to reinforce the importance of justice, accountability, and survivor-centered, trauma-informed care. And also thank you so much for highlighting how the current ongoing instabilities and the deteriorating of the healthcare system is continuing to impact survivors even until this date. So thank you so much again. And I'll now hand over to Tzedena. Tzedena Abadi is a women rights advocate from Tigray and a co-founder and executive director of Yihono, a movement to end gender-based violence. Founded in 2019, Yihono, meaning enough, in Tigrinya, began as a grassroots feminist movement calling for accountability and has grown into a nonprofit providing legal aid, referrals, court case follow-ups, and right-based education for women and girls. Tzedena will speak on survivor advocacy and community-based responses. Tzedena, the floor is yours. You're on mute, Tzedena. I don't know if you're speaking. I see your camera on, your mic is on, but I don't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
If you are speaking.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Tadana, and I'm here representing Yukono, the movement and gender-based violence. I'll be presenting on survivor advocacy and community-based interventions. So survivor advocacy is an approach that places survivors of violence at the center of all interventions and the decisions that affect them. It aims to protect survivors' rights, ensure access to essential services, amplify their voices, and promote their participation in justice and peace-building processes. As most of us here are aware, women and girls were disproportionately affected by sexual violence in the Tigray War, the Tigray genocide, including rape, gang rape, forced pregnancy, and other forms of abuse. So to categorize some of the harms that were done, if we look at physical injuries or physical consequences, we can look at chronic and physical injuries that led to health problems, unwanted pregnancies, sexually transmitted infections, and limited access to healthcare due to the destruction of health facilities during the war. When we go to psychological consequences, we can look at trauma and depression, anxiety and fear, post-traumatic stress disorder, feelings of shame and hopelessness. And then when we continue to social consequences, stigma and discrimination, this has been vastly reported, family rejection, breakdown of social networks, and also reduced participation in community life. This could be due to isolation. And when we look at the economic consequences, loss of livelihoods, increased poverty, and growing dependence on humanitarian aid. So why do we need survivor advocacy? As we mentioned, that survivor advocacy places the survivors at the center of response efforts. So in Tigray, what does this look like? It would mean advocating for justice and accountability for perpetrators, ensuring survivors have access to medical care, psychosocial support, and legal services, fighting stigma and discrimination associated with sexual violence, promoting survivor participation in peace building and reconstruction efforts, and also supporting survivor-led organizations and networks that empower women to share their experiences and stories. Hopefully, this would lead to their safety and also to influence the policy. Okay. When we do survivor advocacy, how do we do it? Or what methods can we use? One is community awareness campaigns. This would include activities such as programming campaigns that would challenge stigma, that would promote gender equality, and that would encourage survivors to report violence and to foster solidarity with survivors and also within the community. Okay, so what are the challenges facing survivor advocacy in Tigray? There have been a lot of efforts in the past years, including present, to support survivors and also to advocate for survivors, but many challenges remain. The previous presenters have listed so many of the challenges that we are facing in Tigray, and to mention some more, stigma. Stigma has been reported by many survivors as it has led to the breakdown of families, for them to to not integrate with their communities, and for most to even have to look for better life in other communities. Excuse me. Many survivors report being blamed and rejected. And there is a shortage of trained professionals and facilities to give them any support. There's also lack of resources, as many organizations that used to support survivors now struggle with insufficient funding. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I have some flu. Okay, so to go to the next topic, community-based response. So what is community-based response? It's
Rena, sorry.
Yes.
Okay, now we hear you. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry. So a community-based response is an approach that mobilizes communities to support survivors and rebuild social cohesion. In Tigray, we have seen many efforts to support this. There have been many shelters and one-stop centers which have been established, and most are still running, although they are struggling with financial and resource issues. And most of them were run by in partnership of local NGOs with international agencies, but as mentioned by previous presenters again, most of the international agencies, UN agencies, have left Tigray, so they are currently struggling with running with resources. And another response has been economic rehabilitation. This is done to help survivors to tackle poverty by offering livelihood trainings and giving them micro grants afterwards to help them with restarting their lives and to equip them with business skills. This has been reported to reduce dependency and lowers the risk of survivors turning into sex works and other relief or begging. Okay, and the next one is grassroots advocacy. This has been done and continues to be done by frontline advocates and also especially NGOs as well. This has been done. There have been many movements domestically, locally, and also internationally. This continually advocates for the full implementation of the Pretoria Agreement, and they help in documenting war crimes. They advocate for survivors' access to unhindered humanitarian aid and demand accountability from international donors. And community outreach programs. These are done to mitigate the severe stigma often faced by victims of sexual violence. Local volunteers and local organizations conduct community outreach programs and awareness raising sessions. This could be done in partnership with religious and community leaders to encourage community-wide acceptance. So key components could include community awareness campaigns to challenge stigma and encourage survivors to seek supports, and mobile health and psychosocial services to reach remote communities, and training community leaders and health workers on survivor-centered care. The economic reintegration programs help survivors regain independence and rebuild their lives. And the women's safe spaces, these have been established in different parts of Tigray to help survivors get a space where they could access counseling, information sharing, and also peer support. Okay, so let's explore what could be the role of civil society organizations in all this. Civil society organizations are usually the first ones to respond to survivors' needs, and their roles could include and continue to include advocacy, advocating for justice and accountability, influencing policies and laws, raising awareness nationally, regionally, and internationally. And they can also support in service provision. This would mean counseling services, legal aid, health referrals, and shelter and protection. And in legal supports, they could help with documentation and recording survivor testimonies ethically and monitoring human rights violations. Okay. So as we mentioned, the importance of putting survivors at the center of all these interventions, we should make sure that survivors participate in advocacy campaigns, peace-building initiatives, community dialogues, and policy development. In most cases so far, in the campaigns that have been done or in the awareness and documentation, there often is a breach in the practices that should be conducted. In some cases where survivors are seen exposed or their identity being exposed, and in some cases because they have such a little support, they are even coming out to ask for support themselves, and this could also lead to their safety being compromised. Okay, so currently I try to assess what actual support the survivors are receiving in the different camps, in the IDP camps especially. And as most of the supporting international NGOs have left, it's only a handful of the CSOs that are giving support to survivors. And there is a shortage in dignity kits, even when they want to access health services because of the lack of health services and medications in Tigray. Even if they go to public hospitals, they now are forced to pay, even if they have a referral paper, because the public hospitals no longer can give free healthcare. They have to pay, and this has been problematic, especially for survivors. And they no longer get aid, so that has been an issue with providing food for themselves and their families. And the main one, with the fear of another war starting in Tigray, they are living in fear of what could happen, who could come the next day, which soldiers will be coming, or if they will even come after them for reporting their cases. So they are living in fear. And this is the current status of the survivors in Tigray. So what can be done now is, one, we must continue to promote justice and accountability initiatives. This could mean documentation of atrocities and also promoting and advocating for survivors' safety and their protection, and also advocating for accountability mechanisms, and also for the humanitarian aid to enters so they could have access to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Selena. You have emphasized how the importance of advocacy and at the same time making sure all the implementations and the programmings that we do are survivor centered, but also at the same time they have to be ethical as well. And it was important to see how the stigma and the lack of social support continues to impact survivors. At the same time, the current lack of funding is continuing to impact them as well. So thank you for those important points. I was very lenient with time today because unfortunately one of our speakers, Ivy, is not joining us because she had an emergency. So now I'm going to hand over the floor to Callie Mitchell. Callie is the head of gender policy portfolio at the New Lines Institute, where she leads research on the women, peace and security agenda, sexual and gender-based violence, and the integration of gender into foreign policy. She holds a master's in gender, security, and human rights from the University of Denver. I will now hand over to you, Callie. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today among such distinguished colleagues. I'd like to add to this discussion by focusing on documentation, memory, and how we can strengthen international advocacy on the issue of CRSV and Tigray through frameworks like the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. As we know, sexual and reproductive violence in Tigray was used systemically and strategically as a weapon of war by parties to the conflict. These acts did not and were not intended to only impact the individual who was directly violated, but to terrorize and, based on many survivor testimonies and investigations, to destroy, in whole or in part, the Tigrayan ethnic group. Survivors are left to deal with the trauma of their violations, the stigma that their experiences are met with, and significant barriers to accessing justice and survivor-centered care and services. By situating the sexual and reproductive violence that occurred during the Tigray conflict within the broader context of gendered vulnerabilities that exist in the region and in Ethiopia as a country, including historical and cultural gender norms and institutional militarized masculinity, we can better understand the severe and long-lasting impact that these violations have on individuals, families, and communities across Ethiopia, and how any meaningful approaches to preventing and responding to this violence requires more than legal accountability. It demands a fundamental shift in the gendered power structures that perpetuate it around the world. So I'd first like to highlight that deeply entrenched gender norms serve as the driver of wartime sexual and reproductive violence. A major barrier to substantively addressing CRSV is that there seems to be a pernicious perception that it occurs in such unique circumstances that we can only react to it when it emerges, rather than preventing it from taking root. This is not true. The drivers of CRSV exist even in peacetime, embedded in societal norms, power structures, and institutions. If we can acknowledge that, then we can be proactive and take steps to dismantle those underlying conditions before violence escalates. The normalization of violence against women is a global issue, deeply rooted in hierarchical systems of male dominance and female subordination across economic, political, and cultural spaces around the world. A 2020 study found that almost half of all Ethiopian women will experience gender-based violence at some point in their lives. These patterns reflect systemic issues that transcend borders and cultures, as globally, 1 in 3 women will experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. These same norms and structures that normalize violence against women in peacetime also enable and escalate sexual and gender-based violence in conflict, which builds on pre-existing inequalities and cultures of impunity. This is referred to as the continuum of violence. When this sort of violence is normalized in society, it's a lot easier to weaponize it as a tool of war, control, and punishment when conflict does emerge. This continuum of violence plays a critical role in the development of collective memory and of intergenerational trauma when it comes to CRSV. The memory of CRSV in Tigray is not confined to those who directly experienced the violence. The continued physical, psychological, and social consequences have distorted the collective understanding of agency, identity, and community. These understandings can create intergenerational relationships that will outlast the length of the conflict. The collective memory of conflict-related sexual violence and reproductive violence highlights the importance of preserving gendered experiences within the historical record. In many post-conflict settings, women's experiences are underreported, excluded from official accounts, and survivors may decline to report in fear of social backlash, which results in incomplete and inaccurate accounts of conflict and its impact. Survivor testimony, medical records, and community-led documentations in Tigray have played a critical role in ensuring that CRSV is not viewed as a consequence of the war, but as a defining aspect of the conflict's human toll. Based on data from over 480,000 survivors, the Commission of Inquiry on Tigray Genocide found that 59.5% of survivors suffered sexual and gender-based violence during the conflict, including the perpetration of over 152,000 sex crimes, concluding that the violence was indeed systemic and weaponized. Preserving these experiences within the historical record is an urgent need, essential for advancing accountability, for supporting survivor-led justice mechanisms, and for preventing the erasure of gendered harms from collective memory. Given that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights inquiry into Tigray was prematurely terminated due to quote-unquote positive developments in the region, despite the fact that other research, such as that of Physicians for Human Rights, has found that sexual violence continued after the cessation of hostilities, this urgency simply cannot be overstated. While the post-conflict efforts often emphasize reconciliation, stability, and social cohesion, survivors continue to seek acknowledgement, justice, and accountability for the harms that they endured. Efforts to move beyond conflict without full recognition and awareness of survivors' experiences could risk marginalizing victims and creating gaps between policy and implementation. Furthermore, it could further marginalize vulnerable groups, and sustainable peace is not only built on ending hostilities, but also on preserving an accurate historical record and ensuring survivors' voices are at the center of all reconciliation and transitional justice mechanisms. This is why international advocacy is essential. One mechanism I'd like to highlight today is the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, which has become a critical framework for promoting the recognition of and response to the perpetration of sexual violence in conflict. Beyond serving as a tool for response, it can also be used proactively to transform these structures. The WPS agenda, enshrined by UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, recognizes that women's meaningful participation in peace and security processes is not only an intrinsic need, but a prerequisite to sustainable peace. Through its pillars, the agenda also challenges the gendered power structures that enable discrimination, conflict, and gender-based violence. A core pillar of the WPS agenda is preventing and responding to CRSV, which, as I've discussed, requires dismantling the core structural drivers of violence that escalate into conflict-related gender-based crimes. This means that international progress needs to be made towards challenging gendered hierarchies that exist in all spaces, shift the perception of GBV not as an inevitability of conflict, but as a preventable human rights violation. However, as the agenda reached its 25th anniversary in October of 2025, we are at a time where we need to acknowledge that progress towards its global goals has been limited and implementation inconsistent, with many states prioritizing reactive rather than proactive and transformative approaches to WPS. By promoting women's inclusion in peace and security, by challenging militarized approaches to conflict, and by addressing the root causes of gender-based violence, WPS offers a pathway to preventing CRSV before it occurs. We must also ensure that all survivors of CRSV and Tigray receive the care, justice, and support needed to rebuild their lives and to end the continuum of violence. In the case of Tigray, where survivors face immense barriers to accessing medical care, psychosocial support, and legal redress, the need for improved focus on survivor relief and recovery is particularly relevant. Ensuring that survivors receive comprehensive and sustained support, not only in the immediate aftermath, but throughout their long-term recovery, must remain a key priority in international advocacy. Sexual violence in Tigray was not an isolated atrocity. It is a symptom of deeper gendered power structures that persist in conflicts worldwide. The WPS agenda and other international advocacy mechanisms have the potential to be effective tools for challenging these structures. However, if they are to mean anything, they must be consistently and meaningfully implemented, not only to rhetorically promote accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, but to prevent it before the onset of conflict, and to ensure that where it does occur, survivors receive the care and support they deserve. Tigray is a test of our commitments. If we are serious about change, we must turn words into action, justice into healing, and promises into meaningful, sustained support for survivors. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kali, for the wonderful presentation. You really did highlight the systematic nature of the CRSV that took place in Tigray, including the evidences that perpetrators intend to destroy through the acts of sexual violence. And you highlighted that this violence is also are stored in the memory, continue to shape identity, community structures, and collective memory. And of course, this is important that we need to document, understand, and work towards as a community. And also the fact that you highlighted these violences are preventable, and mentioning the WPS agenda as a tool to work towards prevention instead of just response is also really important. So thank you so much, Kali. And of course, I think we've mentioned that a few of the key housekeeping rules. We've mentioned that this session is being recorded when we are working toward the discussion. So make sure your comments, discussion points are respectfully shared. But also at the same time, I know we've spent over almost an hour and 30 minutes now on this session, and it could be heavy, or it could also result in some difficult emotions. So if anyone needs to step away, take a moment, please do that. And now we are coming to our final two presenters for today. I am going to hand over to Sarah if she's ready, because we're just doing one more shuffle in the schedule. Hopefully, Sarah, you would be able. Okay, awesome. I see you nodding. So, okay, I'll then now introduce Sarah. Sarah Hunter is a senior research and advocacy officer at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Project, where she works on populations at risk of mass atrocity crimes, with a particular focus on the Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. Much of her work has focused on the Horn of Africa. It has focused on drawing international attention to atrocity, risks, and human rights crisis across Ethiopia. Sarah today will speak on the responsibility to protect, prevent, and accountability mechanism. I'll hand over to you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much as well, and good morning or evening, everyone, depending on where you are. And thank you all for organizing the event and for the remarks of all of the great speakers that came before me. It is an honor to join you on the International Day for the Elimination of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence for this discussion, though I wish we were gathering to discuss justice achieved rather than justice still deferred and denied. Years after the worst atrocities committed during the war in Tigray, and some of the worst atrocities that I've covered in my over decade as a human rights advocate, many survivors are continuing to live with profound physical and psychological trauma, inadequate access to care, and unresolved questions about missing relatives and the ongoing consequences of displacement, which colleagues ahead of me during this event have very eloquently highlighted. For countless women and girls, the conflict hasn't ended with the cessation of major hostilities. The consequences of what's happened to them remain part of everyday life. And today I would like to reflect on what the experiences of survivors in Tigray teach us about atrocity prevention, why accountability remains essential to preventing further abuses and future abuses, and what responsibilities now rest with the Ethiopian government, regional institutions, and the broader international community. The widespread and systematic use of sexual violence documented throughout this conflict was not simply a byproduct of war. The evidence that was collected by survivors and healthcare providers and civil society and UN investigators and human rights experts revealed recurring patterns across multiple locations over an extended period of time. Survivors described similar forms of abuse, similar language used by perpetrators, and similar efforts to humiliate not only individual women, but the broader Tigrayan community as a whole. Women reported gang rape and sexual slavery, forced impregnation, and acts of sexual torture. Many describe perpetrators invoking ethnicity during their attacks, explicitly linking the violence to their identity. These accounts show that the sexual violence was being used not only to harm them as an individual, but to terrorize their entire community, fracture their social bonds, and reinforce broader campaigns of persecution. And this distinction matters. Too often, conflict-related sexual violence is treated as a secondary consequence of armed conflict rather as a tactic that serves military, political, and ideological objective. Yet, from Bosnia to Darfur, from Myanmar to Tigray, we've repeatedly seen sexual violence used as a tool to dominate population, forcibly displace communities, and attack the social fabric that binds people together. For those of us working on atrocity prevention, widespread sexual violence is therefore more than just a human rights concern and abuse. It's often an indicator of deeper patterns of dehumanization and persecution and organized violence against civilians. It's a warning sign that atrocity crimes are actively occurring and are likely to continue to escalate. The experiences of women and girls in Tigray should have prompted a much stronger sense of urgency from the international community, precisely because they revealed these broader dynamics. One of the clearest lessons from Tigray is that early warning does not automatically produce early action. We had accounts from survivors and healthcare workers who were documenting injuries and what they were seeing. Civil society was raising alarms and trying to badger the international community and individual member states to act. International bodies were producing detailed reporting. The problem wasn't a lack of information, it was a failure to translate that information into timely political action. And this is precisely the challenge that R2P was designed to address. R2P rests on the principle that states have a primary responsibility to protect populations from atrocity crimes, and that the international community has a responsibility to act when those protections break down, or in this case, the state is actively the perpetrator of those atrocities. And in this case, the responsibility to protect has failed. In Tigray, the warning signs that R2P identifies, the widespread attacks on civilians, the ethnicized rhetoric, the restriction on humanitarian engagement, systematic sexual violence, and we can continue on the abuses that occurred, were visible very early, I would say, in the first days and weeks of the conflict. Yet diplomatic engagement remained fragmented for the entirety of the war. Accountability efforts are still struggling to secure any lasting support, and international response never matched the scale of the risk. Survivors were therefore left with the impression that their suffering was acknowledged but not prioritized. And so today, the idea that accountability can be postponed indefinitely in the name of stability or peace is deeply concerning and completely unacceptable. In practice, accountability is one of the most important tools available to preventing future violence. When perpetrators face no meaningful consequence, sexual violence becomes easier to view as an effective and low-risk tactic in war. When violations are investigated and acknowledged and prosecuted, the political and legal cost of abuse changes. The absence of this accountability does more than deny justice to the individual survivors, it shapes the behavior of future perpetrators. And this, as we stand on a precipice in Ethiopia, is incredibly important today. Although the Pretoria Agreement brought an end to active hostilities in Tigray, many of the conditions that contributed to the atrocity crimes that took place there remain present not only in Tigray but across the country. Armed conflict continues in several regions. Political tensions remain at arguably an all-time high. Human rights violations continue to be reported across the board, and civic space and media space remains constrained and shrinking. and survivors in many communities continue to struggle to access even a meconium of justice. Reports of conflict-related sexual violence have also emerged not only from Tigray, but also from Oromia and Amhara and other conflict-affected regions. The circumstances differ, the actors involved may differ, but themes recur with a troubling consistency. Militarization, weak accountability and justice mechanisms, little to no civilian protection, and the persistent marginalization of survivors. And this is why accountability for the crimes committed in Tigray matters far beyond Tigray itself. How Ethiopia addresses these violations will influence whether future perpetrators believe such crimes can continue without consequence. And unfortunately, the trajectory of international accountability efforts has been deeply disappointing. International investigations, including the creation of the Human Rights Council mandated International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, played an essential role in documenting violations and establishing an authoritative record of what happened in Tigray. They helped ensure that survivors were heard and that abuses could not simply be erased from our history books. But over time, international scrutiny has weakened and political attention has shifted elsewhere. For many survivors, the decision to allow the mandate of the International Commission to lapse was experienced not just as a procedural adjustment, but as a form of abandonment. It reinforces the perception that accountability remains vulnerable to shifting geopolitical priorities and that justice can be negotiated away when it becomes politically inconvenient. This perception matters because accountability efforts derive their legitimacy from the confidence that survivors place in them. When survivors lose faith that justice is possible, long-term consequences extend beyond individual cases. Your trusted institution is eroded, reconciliation in communities becomes exceedingly more difficult, and the risk of future violence directly increases. The accountability gap is particularly stark with respect to the Eritrean forces. Survivors, human rights organizations, and international investigators documented serious allegations of conflict-related sexual violence, extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearances, widespread looting, and a myriad of abuses by Eritrean troops operating in Tigray. Yet there really is no functional path to justice for those abuses. This means that some of the gravest crimes that were committed in the conflict remain out of reach for prosecution. And that gap weakens both deterrence in the region and the prospects for a durable peace. And this is why many of us continue to call for a regional accountability mechanism to be established and hope that we see that become a reality soon in the future. The international community, therefore, has a variety of important responsibilities moving forward. States should be continuing to support documentation and evidence preservation initiatives led by Ethiopian and international civil society partners. Justice processes often take years and sometimes decades and don't align neatly with recommendations from member states. Preserving this evidence today ensures that accountability remains possible tomorrow and in the years to come. Governments whose legal systems also permit universal jurisdiction should be actively exploring and allowing opportunities to investigate and prosecute individuals credibly implicated in atrocity crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence. Survivors should not be left without any options simply because domestic accountability remains elusive. Donor government should ensure also that support for transitional justice initiatives is accompanied by meaningful consultation with survivors and affected communities. Accountability processes are the most effective when they reflect the priorities and experiences of those directly impacted. International partners should also be continuing to support long-term healthcare, psychosocial services, and economic assistance for survivors. Recovery from conflict-related sexual violence does not occur on a timeline of donor funding cycles. Many survivors are going to require support for years to come, and this is a direct cost of the international community's preventive failure, and we must ensure that we do not fail victims again. At the Human Rights Council, member states must move beyond expressions of concern that are not matched by sustained action. As independent international scrutiny has diminished, so too is the visibility of the ongoing violations across the country. States should be supporting the establishment of a designated mechanism capable of providing regular public reporting on the human rights conditions and atrocity risks throughout the country. And this could include strengthening the presence of the OHCHR and giving them a mandate for robust monitoring and reporting, or establishing a special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Ethiopia, tasked with publicly reporting on ongoing investigations, engaging with survivors and civil society, and identifying emerging risks before they escalate onto mass atrocities. At a time when access for independent investigators and media remains limited, OHCHR is one of the only international actors with the capacity to engage consistently across multiple regions of the country. And sustained public reporting is not a substitute for accountability, but an essential tool for preventing further abuses and ensuring we're having a good understanding of what's happening on the ground. Without this independent monitoring and transparent reporting, violations are easier to conceal, survivors are easier to ignore, and opportunities for early action are lost. Prevention also requires recognizing that the dangers that lie ahead. At a time of heightened geopolitical tensions across the Horn, growing mistrust between regional actors, and unresolved political and security disputes, the risk of renewed conflict cannot be ignored. Should tensions escalate further, there's a very real concern that Tigray will once again become a battleground for competing political and military interests. The international community must not wait for another crisis to emerge before acting, and states should be consistently calling for de-escalation, discouraging inflammatory rhetoric and military posturing, and pressing all parties to resolve disputes through dialogue and peaceful means. Regional and international actors must refrain from actions that fuel instability or deepen existing tensions, and instead support diplomatic efforts aimed at reducing the risk of renewed conflict. The African Union should also have an important role to play if it so chooses. The AU should help ensure that justice remains part of the conversations about sustainable peace, support survivor-centered approaches to reconciliation, and encourage credible investigations into serious violations. And for the Ethiopian government, meaningful reconciliation requires more than promises of national unity that are unrealized. Reconciliation can't be built upon silence and selective memory or the expectation that survivors simply move on. It requires an acknowledgement of harm and credible investigations, accountability for perpetrators regardless of rank or affiliation, institutional reforms that reduce the likelihood of future violations, and sustained investment in survivor support, including healthcare and psychosocial services, economic assistance, and reparations. And most importantly, survivors themselves must be included to shape these processes and feel safe and able to do so. A survivor-centered approach, as been mentioned, is not simply about listening to testimony and about ensuring that survivors have a meaningful role in determining how justice, truth-telling, and reconciliation efforts are designed and implemented. As we gather today, I think we should remember that the historical record of what happened in Tigray exists largely because survivors refused to be silent. Women and girls who had every reason to be afraid and to not speak about what happened to them chose to speak. Community organizers documented these abuses despite enormous personal risk that continues to this day, and advocates continued pressing for accountability even as international attention has faded. The women and girls of Tigray shouldn't have to spend the rest of their lives proving what happened to them happened. Their experiences have been documented and their voices have been heard by all of us. And the question now is whether governments and the international institutions are prepared to act on what they already know. And that's the test for accountability and also a test for prevention, and to ensure that future generations and future women and girls in Tigray do not experience these same egregious experience. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was such an important presentation. You've really given us a highlight of how the lack of the international community, the failure of the international community to respond to the atrocities that happened in Tigray, even though there has been clear documentation of what happened, the intent of what happened, the systematic nature of it, and the current lack of movements towards justice, and also the inadequate mechanisms for justice that are in place. And of course, thank you for the insights for the way forward. Those are really important. Okay, and I'm so sorry. The presentations are so important, and I've been so bad with time today, but we are on heading to our last present speaker of the day, Mabrahtu Khalayu, is a public health professional specializing in reproductive health, sexual and gender-based violence response, and humanitarian health programming. And since 2025, he's served as the SGBV Health Response Coordinator at Tigray Health Bureau. And he has worked in strengthening clinical management of rape and survivor-centered care in Tigray. He's also a faculty at Mekelle University School of Public faculty member. And he will be presenting about health sector challenges and survivor recovery services in Tigray. I'll hand over to you, Mabrahtu.
Okay, thank you very much for introducing the topic. So I think you have had a long period of time in the presentation, so I will make a short because many people can make present or can teach many things. So the challenge in medical service for survivors in Tigray currently is, as you know, currently in Tigray there is no enough advocacy for service or for supplies to international community, as earlier Sarah explained. So due to that, we have a shortage of essential medicines, particularly for treatment of STI, different post-rape kits, and still the supplies are interrupted now and then, and there is a delay in replacement of medicines. As you know, during the war, there was a response because facilities was damaged or looted, and facility providers or healthcare providers were not in the facility. So still, our women are in different chronic illness and demanding a lot of medical expenditure, but still there is no enough supplies in our facility. The most challenging is still insufficient operational resources, interactive partner support, limited supplies and equipment, and high caseload. Though still we have the high caseload, but supplies are very limited. Still, we have also limited with high staff turnover due to, as you know, Tigray currently there is no enough budget from the federal government, and all our staffs are working without any salary. So those who have alternative to alternative employment leave the facilities alone. So difficulty in maintaining comprehensive services, particularly services out of one center. So still at impact, still there is repeated STI infections in the cure rate of STI is very low. And there is also high psychological distress among survivors, and as a consequence, there is also social exclusion and stigma, and long term of survivors. So we call out as a way forward. We recommend or we call the international community to ensure uninterrupted medical supplies, strength in the one-stop centers and TMR corners, and to increase the mental health service because of figures indicate that almost more than 68% of survivors have had developed mental health problems. So the mental health service also should be promoted. And we call on the international community on promoting accountability and the survivors' access to care. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Abrahtu, for that important addition to today's presentation. You have given us a picture of how the continuous withdrawal of international community from the humanitarian response, but at the same time, the withdrawing of the budget that's from the federal government coming to Tigray from the federal government is affecting current medical supplies. Fuel also, I see it's also affecting healthcare workers' ability to continue to work in the health sectors. Those who can are leaving, and those who cannot continue to struggle. And of course, this is also a continuation because of the intentional deliberate damage that had taken place to the healthcare system in Tigray. And thank you so much for emphasizing the call for action from international communities. So yes, I know we're a bit going a bit over time, but I would like to see the questions. There are a few questions in the chat. I think everyone, you can maybe write the questions that you have in the chat, or if you would like to raise your hand and ask questions, I'll also give you the floor. But let's try to make our questions very precise and to the point. We can't promise that speakers will be able to address everything, but a lot of it we can also take as a home take. Okay, I see first there are a few questions that are already here. I'll start with the first one from Zenawi. He says, the issue of CRSV has been discussed widely for years now, although not much is done to address the problem. I wonder if we should not now give emphasis to creating awareness and including both genders in the process. It is now just conflict-related challenges. It is not just conflict-related challenges. The problem is becoming so serious, even in what is considered to be post-conflict. I wonder if you also reflect on what needs to be done next. I think, Tselena, I will hand over to you, maybe to respond to this question as you're working on the ground with communities. And I know recently you've been trying to work and including all genders, both genders in the work. Tselena?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Definitely, it's very important to include both genders in this work. I actually have been to a couple of trainings where not only organized by us, but organized by other organizations. It's not just the women that are being called to these trainings. Men are also being included. And when it comes to the community interventions as well, when you're training the religious heads and the community influencers, I see both genders being included. So it's very important. So I don't think it's a targeted training that's the problem now. I think it's more of when these people that have been trained go back to their communities, are they actually implementing those trainings and also training other people in their communities to help survivors and also to accommodate survivors. So personally, I don't see the trainings being gendered or targeting only women. So I don't know if he noticed something else, but that's not my observation. But it's definitely very important to include everyone in the community, regardless of gender or wherever they are in the social hierarchy, if there is one. Everyone in the community should be aware of the issues survivors are facing, and also be very ready to assist in whatever way they can to make life easier for them.
I think there's also one more point. I think he's also talking about how, of course, he puts post-conflict in quotation, which we share, but even in the after the cessation of hostilities, when there is still ongoing sexual violence, which you've been working in the different femicide cases and so on. So it's he's maybe also trying to address that question.
Sorry, can you rephrase that?
Okay. Also, Zenawi, if you're here, you can maybe, because I don't want to misquote you. I don't know if Zenawi is here, but so he's saying, I wonder if we should now give emphasis to create awareness and include both genders in the process, but it's not just conflict-related challenges. So he's trying to see how the domestic violence and are still ongoing.
Definitely, it's not only conflict-related violences. Actually, we see this problem a lot, where most of the gender-based violence cases that were reported after the Pretoria Agreement have been attributed to the conflict as if they're a result of the trauma. It's understandable that society may have issues related with trauma, and it could manifest in certain aggressions. But I think it's very important to also acknowledge the level of gender-based violence that is prevalent, and also the gender-based violence survivors, and also femicide victims. Most of them have they're not really we can't put the reason as if it's because they survived a war. So we should be very mindful to not downplay some cultural aspects of different societies, and in the way violence could be manifested and also viewed. So we need to work on gender-based violence awareness in every part of the society, and also strengthen the justice systems to deal with those cases accordingly, and to provide justice to the families and their survivors, and also to prevent further cases from happening.
Okay, thank you. I think Magda has put some comment, kind of questions. So I think the first one is a little bit somehow addressed by Tzedena in her current response. So maybe I'll hand over to Sarah. I've already shared the question with her. The second one, what could constituencies in Tigray do to facilitate efforts of getting region-level justice and accountability that you had mentioned?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll preface just kind of my response to the comment with, I'm not located in Tigray, and obviously I'm not Tigrayan. So there are structures and community level organizing that I am not accessible to. But I know that colleagues on this call and some that I work with closely are doing this work generally. But I think that in terms of trying to facilitate the regional level type justice, I mean, I think we're a long way off from a regional mechanism being created. Obviously, there's little to no buy-in by regional states, and I don't think that will change without a change in kind of power dynamics in those countries, because at this point, high-level officials in the Eritrean government and officials at the highest level of the Ethiopian government as well, bear responsibility for not only the conflict-related sexual violence that occurred, but many other war crimes and crimes against humanity and the ethnic cleansing that took place in Tigray. So there's not a big buy-in from those perpetrators to create a court for themselves to then sit in. But I think that things do change, that, the pendulum will swing back a way that I hope will be more conducive to justice in the future. And in terms of what we can do now to kind of continue to lay the groundwork of that is to, continue the documentation of ongoing abuses, right? Because we're not speaking about conflict-related sexual violence in Tigray in past tense. There are still instances of it occurring today. So continuing to document and also working with colleagues on this call, international partners, domestic partners, to kind of amplify that fact, because I think that's something that we're really grappling with, is just trying to get states to pay attention to the fact that it's not peace and security, and Ethiopia isn't this bastion of peace in the Horn of Africa that it would like to present itself to be to the international community. So continuing to document and collect evidence of what's happening, and also continuing to speak out at every single level possible. So in community organizing, in local political affiliations, in Mekelle, in anywhere that political discussions are happening on the situation inside of the region, making sure that survivors, or at least their advocates, are there to reinforce the fact that there's still so much accountability that needs to happen, and that we can't step around accountability in those moments. And so I think that continuing to keep the pressure on in every way, so doing so from the bottom up, but then also from the top down, like at colleagues on this call and I, we don't take the pressure off at the international level. We are still having these conversations at the Human Rights Council. I'm still having these conversations at the UN in New York, and really trying to figure out how we work together to continue to keep the pressure on. At the Global Center where I work, after the ending of ICRI, all the partners that we worked with, we were kind of just like, everybody knows that we need to continue this work and continue documenting and continuing pushing for accountability. But how do we all kind of do that? And so we've created kind of a working group on accountability for atrocities in Ethiopia, where we just come together every month and everybody discusses what they're working on and how we can kind of collaborate and help. And a lot of different initiatives have come out from that. So I'd be happy to be in touch with anybody on this call or beyond about that work and joining that work and trying to make it, an even more expansive, collaborative experience, because the work is long term. It's not a near term or a short term goal. Accountability is something that we will hopefully see in the next decade to come. And if we're not organized around that fact, it will not happen. It definitely won't. So just keeping the pressure on in every fora possible, I think, is the best thing that we can do currently, and continuing to try to chip away and draw attention back to the situation in Tigray is 100% crucial to achieving that.
Thank you so much for that input, Sarah. I hope, Makda, you're here and your question is addressed. I will now give the floor to Jonas Gede. You've raised your hand, Jonas. Okay, Makda is giving a thumbs up. Sarah?
Okay, thank you so much, Jacob, for organizing this, and this is a great opportunity for us and for the people at large, especially for the victims of the sexual violence that have been experienced for long years. And I believe personally that it's not still, it's still progressive, because there are many factors that are still contributing, including from operational and service limitations. So with this regard, I think we have to, I'm understanding, we have to level the seriousness and the extent to which and the institutions that could be helpful in addressing these issues. For example, we are just frequently mentioning that the Pretoria Agreement and like something like that, because such agreements, they were good in reducing the hostilities and cessation of hostilities, but with the case of these sensitive issues, it actually gave upfront to the rather sort of perpetuators to the federal government in Ethiopia, which was expected to be one of the leader of the issues that, according to the international reports and reliable sources, is one of the purchaser group that we just have evidences, and the international community agreed on this issue level. But when we just experience these things that considering the past and the future, we're just now discussing about the documentation and such related issues. If we are considering things as a national level, we're considering starting from Pretoria to this one. Still, there are also the victims are also the documentation and related issues could be easily manipulated because they are becoming now an opportunity for different interests to put as a favor to cover their previous commitments, crime commitments, and the things that they already documented in the community. So how do you? My question is, how can this bring an international and full-scale attention, including from documentation to the level of accountability? So with regard, how can the international community and the experienced participants can advise us the sustainable solution to make towards preventing and even recovering from this impact from the last years? And thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. I think, Kelly, if you could hear, I think you've addressed some of the prevention methods earlier. You've also spoken about documentation. So he's asked about documentation, prevention, and also recovery, how recovery could be possible. To maybe address the questions that you could.
Yeah, that's a very complicated question. And again, I'm not on the ground, so understanding kind of the local realities that would be relevant to those considerations. But so I would need to think on it a little bit more, but I would be more than happy to take that conversation online and discuss it further.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone from the panel who wants to address? Also, I see different organizations working on the ground. You can also respond to this question. Okay, Batseba.
I'm sorry. So one thing that we have been working on is just raising the awareness and then communicating with what goes on the ground with international partners. And an easy way, although maybe not so much effective way, that we found ineffective because the conversation, as Jem Tigray, the conversation that we have on the ground, taking it to the UN calls for inputs, is a very simple way to bring the awareness to the UN. However, as I've said previously, it's not, they kind of like try to understand different perspectives and what we have communicated has not been directly recorded. However, in terms of documentation, that is one way. Also, I'm very grateful to Sarah Hunter from the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, because she has convened a working group, including Tigray and other partners, both Tigrayan and the wider Ethiopian community. And that has been a tool to communicate with international partners as well. But specifically in terms of documentation, it is the UN calls for inputs are open, they're publicly available, and sometimes we see our Tigrayan plights going towards reports by UN special rapporteurs, and we're grateful to them as well. However, I think during genocide commemoration events previously that we co-sponsored, we identified that local efforts and community gatherings, community-based documentations are also critical. The local aspect should not be foregone for the international aspect. So the local aspect of community convening, community documentation, writing, and all of those aspects, there are myriads of ways that we can document at the local level. So both are critical, both at the local level and the international level as well. So those are some ways that we as Tigray have used. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Batseba. I think from your response, I'm learning that I think a lot of the individual and community, local grassroots work is really important, and we really need to continue to document, to push, to advocate, to communicate with the international community, as difficult as it is. The responsibility majorly lays on us. So I think having said that, there are a few kind of reflections or additional points from is it Michelle and then Alton. So please, you can read in the comments, but there's one question from Sarah Kedr. Thank you everyone for your presentation. My question relates to the impending war. What has been learned from the previous war that can be used, if at all, to help communities prepare to reduce the devastation caused by sexual violence in conflict? Sarah wanted to, Callie wanted to respond to this question, so I'll hand over to you. I will limit you to maybe 1 minute, 1 minute and a half, yeah?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yes, I think this is a great question. And I think that from a community perspective, I think that where we can start is to, again, really addressing those structural gender norms and ideas that, create the stigma around the perpetration or victimization of survivors of sexual violence. And I think that that's really important work that we can be doing to ensure that these voices are being heard and integrated into any potential community prevention and early warning systems. I also think that local women-led organizations and survivor groups should be empowered to document abuses, to advocate for justice, and to provide crucial socioeconomic support so that women are able to have these spaces to address these issues in a safe and survivor-centered way. And then lastly, I would say that communities should feel empowered to demand accountability and to counter the culture of impunity that is created by, justice systems and mechanisms that allow for these perpetrators to avoid accountability and prosecution. So to push local, federal, and international structures to take it seriously and to address it.
Thank you so much. I think there was also a similar question from Dama in the chat. I mean, like you said, prevention and working on the current existing structures, the gender norms, and so on is very important. But I think creating sustainable peace is working towards a peaceful existence is also very important, because it's hard to say how can we avoid sexual violence. That question is very difficult, because when it comes, when war happens and people are coming with an intention to destroy communities, to attack people, and that is a weapon that is used, and unfortunately no accountability has been taken from the past war. So it also makes it more susceptible to being exposed to further similar violences. So that is why it's very difficult to talk about if we do this, we can prevent it, because people are intentionally coming with the intent to destroy. So no matter what kind of barrier you put, it is becoming difficult to stop. But we are trying to work towards the prevention and accountability, so that at least there is there's some work done there to prevent.
If I could add just one final thought, it's just to build solidarity across communities, across countries, across the world, so that we are meeting every instance of perpetration of CRSV with the same level of outrage, of demands for accountability, and of support for survivors, to ensure that the culture of impunity is countered everywhere to impact Tigray and elsewhere as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're already 20 minutes over, so my last I'll give the floor to Natanim, you've raised your hand. Who is it? Is it Tariq? Yeah. Okay.
እሺ ክልተ ጥያቄታት ነይረናንና ጥያቄ የደልየ ነይረና ንፈቃደኛ ትትኮንከ ማለት ሓንቲ ሕቶ ተላዒላ ክትከውን ትኽእል እያ ምናልባት ሕዚ ኣብ ትግራይ ሲ ኣፍራሒ ዝኾነ ኮንዲሽን ኢና ነና እዞም ኣካል ጉድኣት ተመዛበልትስ ብኸመይ እዮም ውሕስነት ማለት ናይ ስግኣት ናይ ኩናት ስግኣት እኒአና ከመይ ክንገብር ንኽእል ካልኣይቲ ደሞ ኣብዚ ናይ ማዕቐቢ ዘሎ ላስቲካት ወይ ደሞ እዚ ቸንዳ እንዳተቃደደ እዩ ዘሎ ናይ ኣካል ጉድኣት በተለይ ደሞ ኣብ ሽረ ኣብ ኣክሱም ከባቢያን ደሞ ሰብዓ ካሬ ዝርከቡ ኣካል ጉድኣት ኣብ ብጣዕሚ ከቢድ ኩነታት ስለ ዘለው እዚ ክሕሰበልና ይደሊ ኣለኹና ብመቐፃል ደሞ ኣብ ናይ ኣካል ጉድኣት ዝሰርሑ ሲቪል ሶሳይቲ ሳፖርት ኣብ ዘድልየሉ ማለት ኣብ ትግራይ በተለይ ኣብ ናሃና ኣብዞም ክልተ ዞባታት ሞር ዝሰርሑ ትካላት የለውንና ተሓሳብነት ዝግበር ቅድሚ ሕዚ ኤችኣይ ሰርሕ ነይሩና ካልኦትን ምሳና ኮይና ንሰርሕ ነርና ኩላህና ከዓኒ እቲ ሰፖርት ዘድልየና ስለ ዝኾነ ኣብ ኣካል ጉድኣት ዘለዎ ኮንዲሽን ብጣዕሚ ከቢድ ስለ ዘለው እዚ ኣብ ተሓሳብነት ከኣትየልናስ ሕጥፋ ኣለናና እዚ ከመይ ይመስለክን በተለይ ድማ ኣብ ደቂ ኣንስትዮ ኣብ ሽንቲ ቤት ክጥቀማ ሰብዓ ካሬ ዝርከባ ኣካል ጉድኣት ክረምቲ ብምዃኑ መይሱ ደሞ ምስቲ ክረምቲ ዝተዋሓሒዙ ዝመፅእ ናይ ውዑጅ ብዙሕ ነገራት ሕማማት ይመፁ እዮምና ኣካል ጉድኣት ኣብዚ ተጠቃዕቲ ስለዝኾኑ ህፃውንቲ ይኹና ደቂ ኣንስትዮ ተጠቃዕቲ ስለዝኾኑ ተሓሳብነት ክግበረልና እየ ዘቕርብ ዘለኹ ቴንክ
Okay. Thank you, Tariq. I think ካብ ሕቶ ንላዕሊ هم كلنا هم assignment ሒዝናየ እንተኸድና ይሕሻ እዚኣተን ፅቡቓት ነጥብታት ኢኺ ኣልዒልኽሞ ዘሎ ኩሉ ኣብ መሬት ዝሰርሕ ና ደቂ ኣንስትዮ ይኹን ኩሉ መዳይ ዝሰርሕ ሶሪ ሚውት ገይረክ ድምፂ ነይሩ ይቅርታ ታሪክ ሶ هم assignment ክንወስዶ ኢና እዚኣተን unless ለኣየ ብሃምኡ ተራእይኒ ሞ unless there's someone who wants to respond to Tariq's question. There are very important points that she raised about the issue of accessibility to people living with disabilities. And earlier, as she mentioned, in women with disabilities living in IDPs. Because also the rainy season is also upon us, and there will be many health and accessibility challenges, and she's asking that we need to advocate on that and work towards a solution. So unless there's someone here who can provide answers, I will take that as a comment. Okay. Then having said that, thank you so much. This finally brings us to the end of today's event. Thank you everyone and our speakers for your time, for your honesty and the powerful contributions that you made today. Thank you for the organizations that brought us together here and for everyone for listening. We began by saying that survivors come first. If there is one thing to take from today's session, it is that what happened in Tigray and in too many other places cannot be normalized, forgotten, or left without accountability. Survivors are not asking, like earlier mentioned, for sympathy, but they're asking for justice, for recognition, and for a guarantee that this will not happen again. These are not favors to grant. These are obligations to meet, and the world needs to deliver. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and take care of yourselves. Have a lovely evening.
TPM ኣፍደገ ዘመናዊ ትግራይ